Paul Krassner. I played the second. I said over here. Crazy. God, is that okay? Except no, but he said he just wants to stand. He needs to stand.
Okay, well, thank you for being here, first of all. I was hoping for more ado in my introduction.
Oh, I don't want to take away from you.
Well, my favorite introduction was at in Montreal, a comedy event where there were a lot of comedians who were waiting in the green room there, and the MC.
Louder. Pull it a little closer.
How's this?
Yeah.
Nice. You need to
Okay.
push it closer to him. He can't reach it.
No, I can.
Would it be better for him to have a chair?
No, I asked
No,
for this.
we're fine.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks anyway. As long as I can lean against it. This is Walkie, by the way.
Hey, Walkie.
Walkie audience.
Hey, Walkie.
So, they had the MC come into the green room, and they asked all the comedians standing there, sitting there, and said, each one, how would you like to be introduced? And I said, I'll just say I'm a social satirist. And so about 10 minutes later, I was called, and I came on, and he said, okay, we have our next comedian who's a sociopath. Everything went downhill from there. So I'm wearing this jacket. I don't know if you can see it. It's from Mad Magazine. Can you see it?
Yeah. What me worry.
Yeah, that seemed, I think the what me worry is for the upcoming election. And so my daughter gave this to me for Christmas. And it has to do with what was a turning point in my literary life. I was doing, for Mad Magazine, freelance pieces. And a few pieces that they said were too much grown up. And he said, my mother wouldn't like it. And I said, well, your mother isn't a subscriber. He said, I said, well, this was the publisher, William Gaines, who published Mad Magazine. And he said that the editor thought that some stuff was not grown-ups, and I said, well, you mean, because it turned out that there were like 1.25 million of teenagers and pre-teenagers and so and I said, so you don't want adults? And he said, no. I said, I guess you don't want to change horses in midstream. And he said, and this just still rings in my ears, and when he said, now I'm trying to remember it. My vocabulary is leaking, so forgive me for that. So he said, when I said, it must be a horse in the midstream. No, what was the phrase?
Don't change horses in midstream.
Yeah, and he said, not when the horse has a rocket up its ass. And this was the moment I realized that I was going to publish a satirical magazine for adults, because there were none then, not at all. So, so when I started publishing The Realist, a lot of books came out of that. So what I thought I would do here is just have a few little pieces to read and give the context that it was. So I will do this. And the first thing I'll read is just the opening of the book, because I kept stalling, and I finally said, well, if I have an opening, then maybe I can continue. Okay, so here it is. I first woke up at the age of 6. It began with an itch in my leg, my left leg, but somehow I knew I wasn't supposed to scratch it. Although my eyes were closed, I was standing up. In fact, I was standing on a huge stage, and I was playing the violin. I was in the middle of playing the Vivaldi Concerto in A minor. I was wearing a little Lord Fauntleroy suit, ruffled white silk shirt with puffy sleeves, black velvet short pants with ivory buttons and matching vest, white socks and black patent leather shoes. My hair was platinum blonde and wavy. On this particular Saturday evening, January 14th, 1939, I was in the process of becoming the youngest concert artist in any field ever to perform at Carnegie Hall. But all I knew was that I was being taunted by an itch that had become my adversary. I was tempted to stop playing the violin just for a second and scratch my leg with the bow, yet I was vaguely aware that this would not be appropriate. I had been well trained. I was a true professional. But that itch kept getting fiercer and fiercer. Then suddenly an impulse surfaced from my hidden laboratory of alternative possibilities, and I surrendered to it. Balancing on my left foot, I scratched my left leg with my right foot without missing a note of the Vivaldi Concerto. Between the impulse and the surrender, there was a choice. I had decided to balance on one foot, and it was that simple act of choosing which triggered the precise moment of my awakening to the mystery of consciousness. This is me. The relief of scratching my leg was overshadowed by a surge of energy throughout my body. I was being engulfed by some kind of spiritual orgasm, by a wave of born-again ecstasy with no ideological context, no doctrine to explain the shock of my own experience, no dogma to function as a metaphor for the mystery. Instead, I woke up to the sound of laughing. I had heard that sound before, sweet and comforting, but never like this. Now I could hear a whole symphony of delight and reassurance, like clarinets and guitars harmonizing with saxophones and drums. It was the audience laughing. I opened my eyes. There were rows upon rows of people sitting out there in the dark, and they were all laughing together. They had understood my plight. It was easier for them to identify with the urge to scratch than with a little freak playing the violin. And I could identify with them, identifying with me. I knew that laughter felt good, and I was pleased that it made the audience feel good, but I hadn't intended to make them laugh. I was merely trying to solve a personal dilemma. So the lesson I woke up to, this totally nonverbal internal buzz, would serve as my lifetime filter for perceiving reality and its rules. If you could somehow translate that buzz into words, it would spell out one person's logic is another person's humor. So it was, I was considered a child prodigy, and I didn't think I was, because I was, I had a technique for playing, but I had a passion for making people laugh. And so I just decided that I would drive my violin teacher crazy, and it ended up at his death. Yeah, so anytime you want to have me be a hitman, just let me know. So my life, that was the first thing of my life, because although I was 6 years old, I had the feeling of just born, but I had 6 years of relative kind of sophistication, but I came with an innocence, and so so I knew then I wanted to make people laugh. I didn't even know that they were comedians. who did it, but I just, you know, if I could make my family laugh, I could make my mother laugh just by dropping a pencil on the table. And so I would do that. Or if she was mad at me, I would just drop a pencil on the table, and she would forgive me. I ended up performing. I started with using my violin. I gave up when my teacher died. I just put my violin in the closet. And when I started at the age of about 21, I started performing in places, but using the violin as a prop. And so I would play, I would ask, what did Adam say to Eve? And then I would play, don't sit under the apple tree without me. This was before I got political. And so, and it was Lenny Bruce who suggested that I get rid of the prop of the violin and stop and use my real name. I was using my name as Paul Mall. And once again, everything was downhill after that. And this was before there was a Village Gate in New York, which is where I first performed. And then I began to, during the Vietnam War, I was sort of like the peace version of Bob Hope, who always entertained the troops. And so I would, at rallies for civil rights, rallies and the anti-war demonstrations, and I would talk about it there, but I would do it in a form of humor, and so I got a lot of practice that because it was in the guise of a lecture, but I thought that I learned that satire is, as opposed to comedy, that satire was a it had a truth inside of the joke, and so that it was sort of like pasta fazool, you know, where there was a bean for every macaroni. So it was always I would see through the prism of absurdity when on things that were and so anything that was hypocritical or inconsistent or cruel, anything that I saw that in the media was what gave me something to be satirical about. Okay, let's see. Here's and so here's Lenny. Steve Allen was the first subscriber to the Realist, and he sent out a bunch of gifts of the Realist to a bunch of people, including Lenny Bruce. And Lenny Bruce sent a whole bunch of gift subscriptions to a lot of his friends. And so it was a Malthusian kind of increasing the subscribers to the Realist. It was by word of mouth, which is the best kind of advertising because it's free, and you're being told that something is good by someone you trust. It wasn't an ad that would have all kinds of bait and switch, or bitch and swait. So I'll just, and so when Lenny came to New York, he gave me a call, and I met him for the first time, and he was at a Hotel America in Times Square, and so here's the place here. Oh, I should say that at one point, Hugh Hefner at Playboy assigned me to edit Lenny's autobiography, which was titled let's see, what was the one that Dale Carnegie did? There was a book, a self-help book.
How to Win Friends and Lose.
That's right, How to Win Friends and Influence People. So Lenny's title of his autobiography was Talk Dirty and Influence People, How to Talk Dirty. And so, so Playboy had me edit his book with into 6 sections in Playboy, and then they published it as a book. And I was traveling around with him at certain times. Lenny was taking Dilaudid for lethargy and had sent a telegram to a New York contact with the phrase, "Dilaud in disguise," as a code to send a doctor's prescription. Now in Atlantic City, Lenny got sick while waiting for that prescription to be filled. Later, while we were relaxing on the beach, I hesitatingly brought up the subject. I said, don't you think it's ironic that your whole style should be so freeform, and yet you can also be a slave to dope? And he said to me, what does that mean, a slave to dope? And I said, well, if you need a fix, you've got to stop whatever you're doing. So go somewhere and wrap a lamp cord around your arm. He said, then other people's a slave to food. Oh, I'm so famished. Stop the car. I must have lunch immediately or I'll pass out. And I said, you said yourself you're probably going to die before you reach 40. Yeah, he said, but I can't explain. It's like kissing God. And I said, well, I ain't going to argue with that. Lenny, though, he began to get paranoid about my role. He said, you're going to go to literary cocktail parties and you're going to say, yeah, that's right, I found Lenny slobbering in an alley. He would have been nothing without me. Of course, I denied any such intention, but he demanded that I take a lie detector test. And I was paranoid enough to take it literally. I told him I couldn't work with him if he didn't trust me. We got into an argument, and I left for New York. I sent a letter of resignation to Playboy and a copy to Lenny. A few weeks later, I got a telegram from him that sounded like we had been on the verge of divorce. It said, why can't it be the way it used to be? And I agreed to try again. In December 1962, I flew to Chicago to resume working with Lenny on his book. He was performing at the Gate of Horn. When I walked into the club, he was asking the whole audience to take a lie detector test. And he recognized my laugh. So Lenny was my first, Mort Saul and Lenny Bruce were both my mentors, whether they knew it or not. And they were different. Mort Saul was very political and intellectual, and Lenny was more biological, and he would talk about politicians and their, well, for example, John F. Kennedy. You know, he would talk about their sexuality, and you know, such as Marilyn Monroe and other models. There was a lot of that. I mean, now it would be at a campaign. People say, well, you know, you went, but then it was a taboo. None of the media was mentioning what he did with mistresses and cheat on his wife. It was just unknown by known by the media, but not mentioned by them. Now it would be in the front page. It was an interesting thing to travel with Lenny Bruce, because he had he might have a throwaway line at a performance, and then on another performance he would expand it to a minute or two, and then over the weeks where he was performing, he would have like a 10-minute routine that he had, and that's how he did it. It just evolved as he went along, and so that was a lesson to me, that it was not just a static thing, that it would evolve as you performed. Let's see. Okay, this was during 1967, the Summer of Love, and when there was a lot of psychedelics. When LSD became illegal, the psychedelic oracle was a underground paper that in San Francisco. The psychedelic oracle became politicized, and the radical Berkeley Bar began to treat the drug subculture as fellow outlaws. So now there was to be an event in the nation's capital that would publicly cross-fertilize political protesters with hippie mystics. The plan was simple: to defy the law of gravity. It was decided to hold a special ceremony which would levitate the Pentagon 100 feet. We applied for a permit, then revealed to the media that Pentagon officials wanted to limit levitation to 22 feet. Because that was the height of their ladders. So they'd still be able to pull the building down. But later they insisted on restricting it to no more than 3 feet above the ground, and the press accurately reported that. In order to build up further interest in the event, we staged preliminary pranks that were bound to get media coverage. Abby Hoffman invented an imaginary new drug, a sexual equivalent to the police tear gas, mace. It was christened lace, supposedly a combination of LSD and DMSO, which when applied to the skin would be absorbed into the bloodstream and get an instantaneous aphrodisiac. Lace was actually Schwartz Disapiro from Taiwan. When sprayed, it left a purple stain and disappeared. A press conference was called at Abby and Anita's apartment where Lace could be observed in action. I was supposed to be there as a reporter who accidentally sprayed with lace from a squirt gun. To my surprise, I would put down my pad, take off my clothes, and start making love with a beautiful redhead who had also gotten accidentally sprayed, along with another deliberately sprayed couple right there in the living room, while the journalists took notes. I was really looking forward to this combination of media event and blind date. Even though the sexual revelation was at its height, there was something exciting about knowing in advance that I was guaranteed to get laid. Although I felt somewhat guilty about attempting to deceive fellow reporters. But there was a scheduling conflict. I was already committed to speak at a literary conference at the University of Iowa on that same day. So instead of being accidentally dosed with lace, I was assigned by Abby to purchase cornmeal in Iowa, which would be used to encircle the Pentagon as a pre-levitation rite. I was supposed to be a rationalist, but it was hard to say no to Abby. In Iowa, novelist Robert Stone drove me to a farm. I told the farmer I'd like to buy some cornmeal to go. "Coarse or fine?" he asked. I glanced at Stone for guidance. He shrugged and said, "Well, since it's a magic ritual, I would definitely recommend coarse." "Coarse, please," I said to the farmer. "How many pounds?" 13, please." The farmer smiled and said there was no charge. He was just anxious for us to get out of there. And so I flew back to New York with a 13-pound sack of coarse cornmeal properly stored in the overhead rack. Meanwhile, there were stories about lace in the New York Post, the Daily News, and Time magazine, including the promise that 3 gallons of lace would be brought to Washington, along with a large supply of plastic water pistols, so that lace could be sprayed on police and the National Guard at the Pentagon demonstration. Meanwhile, the guy who substituted for me in the accidental sexual encounter with the beautiful redhead at the lace press conference ended up living with her. Even though I had never met her, I was jealous. Somehow I felt cheated. But this was the purpose of this was to, we didn't have any advertising budget, and so the thing was to give them something good that they could write about and quote from us naughty quotes, and it was a way of them having information about where we were going to go at the Pentagon. And so people who thought, well, the lace was going to be sprayed there, we could see police and National Guardsmen put into action the slogan, make love, not war. So it was a mutual manipulation with the media. So one more little thing here. And this was when I was covering the Patty Hearst trial. In April 1976, on the same day that the Pope announced that he was not gay, that's true, I mean, he did. I received a registered letter from the FBI informing me that I was on a hit list of the Amelia